Hello, everyone, and welcome to Being Jewish. This is about being Messianic. And today we are so excited because we had talked last week about the tabernacle, and today we're going to be talking about Solomon's temple or the first temple. And my name is Gail, and welcome to this discussion. And we're going to dive right in. So, as I said, last week we talked about the tabernacle, and there is a model of it in Israel that you can go and see. And the tabernacle was a portable sanctuary, and it was used by the Israelites when they left Exodus. And the great thing about it was portable; they could carry it on their journey through the 40 years in the deserts. And it was a symbol of God's presence. It was a central symbol of God's covenant with Israel and His presence in their midst. It did house the Ark of the Covenant, which had inside of it, we talked last week about the Ten Commandments, which were the most sacred objects of the Israelites. It was a rectangular structure. It had wooden boards and covered with gold. And it had curtains and coverings of various materials. There was the two main areas to it, which was the holy place, which is the main tent area you see. And then the back was the holiest of holies. And that chamber had a large veil and it housed the Ark of the Covenant. The high priest can only, even this is the same way in the temple, but the high priest can only enter this most sacred place once a year on Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. The rest of the time, they're not allowed to go in there. And the tabernacle was the place of worship. They had sacrifices. You can see where they had sacrifices, and we're going to dig into it. When you get into the temple, you'll see a lot more about it. But the tabernacle was the foundation for setting up and creating the temple. So, as I said, we're looking at Solomon's temple, and it's also called the first temple or Bet Makadesh. And it's a structure that's central to the Jewish faith and history. We're going to look at its origins, its construction, some significance, the destruction. And like I said, it was the first temple, and it was built during the reign of King Solomon in the 10th century BCE. And it was the central sanctuary for the Israelites and where they went to worship and to seek God. We have talked in the past about that even in the other day and the old days, there still were synagogues, which are a place of study in other towns. But if you wanted to go to the temple, you had to go to this temple. One of the things I'm going to be focused on, I'm going to be focusing on the details today, but I want you to, as we look at the details, and I'm going to even show you at the end, the breakdown that I used just for this presentation. And there's so many details that are known about Solomon's temple, and God was so specific about it. And we need to look at that and think about it. This was made with love. This temple was made with love and dedication. And there was a covenant between the Lord and the Jewish people, and there was so much to it. You are going to be amazed when I show you just some of the scriptures that I found on it. And I'll be rattling off some scriptures, but again, at the end, I will have a link if you want to go to what I created based upon what the Lord was giving me and what I was finding. But again, there's a lot more out there, and we'll touch on that later. So where did it come from? David had a vision. King David he really had a longing for a permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant, which was the symbol of God's covenant with Israel. We know that from Exodus 25, verse 22. And David had passion about it. However, God deemed him a man of battles and said he wasn't going to be the one to build the temple. And we know that from First Chronicles chapter 28. In David's vision, he did conquest of Jerusalem, and he gathered sources together. And he laid the essential foundation for his son Solomon to make this monumental undertaking. And this really highlights the intention and preparation. Even we can't always see the full picture. This started over years, and the temple making it was a crowning achievement of Solomon's reign, and it represented a long culmination of this long-held desire by the people and the kings themselves to build it. It was built on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. We know that from 2 Chronicles 3:1, and it became the central place of worship. There was pilgrim and festivals, and David had a placement of the ark in Jerusalem from 2 Samuel chapter 6, and that is what established the city as both the political and spiritual heart of the nation. So while Jerusalem, even later on, became the capital of Judah after the king's divisions, it's always had this spiritual and significance. It's a very religious significance. We know even today there are people that are fighting over the religious aspects of it. It still remains a central part of it. It also became, if you saw when you read in Isaiah um, and Second Kings, there was a lot of prophetic things that happened there. And of course, we know that Jesus was also in Jerusalem and at the temple. Well, he was at Herod's temple, but he was at the Temple Mount. So all of this temple, it was built, and then it came to an end in 586 BEC when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, and the temple was destroyed, and the people were exiled. So it was a huge turning point. But for a time, it was the central place, and later on, it was rebuilt. So David had a strategic capture of Jerusalem, and when he did that, it was able to unite all the tribes of Israel together. And the interesting thing about Mount Moriah and why it was chosen was because that's also where the binding and the near sacrifice of Isaac happened. And David, it was a very interesting way he did it. He ended up buying this land from a Jebusite and be able to take it. The land where the temple was built was actually a threshing floor at one point. That's what the Jebusites were using it for. So even from the beginning, the threshing and the grain and all of those things were part of that particular site. So the location where the first temple stood is not exactly known. It's believed that it's on part of the area where the second temple was and the present day Temple Mount. But we aren't exactly sure exactly where it is. So, according to the Bible, Solomon's temple was built on Mount Moriah, where an angel of God appeared to David in Second Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. And again, I said that it was a threshing floor. So, Solomon's temple, again, it was more than just a building. It really was the relationship that they had with God. And there's a lot of scriptures for it. The scriptures show impressive design in the material. For example, the cedar in 1 Kings chapter 5, the gold in 1 Kings chapter 6, bronze in 1 Kings chapter 7, precious stones that were used, 1 Chronicles 29. And we know that it had three main sections. It had the outer court from 1 Kings 6:8, the holy place from 1 Kings 6:2, and the holiest of holies in 1 Kings chapter 6. And we know that's where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. There's a lot of other things like the molten sea, the laveers, the menorah, the table of showbread, the altar of incense. But all of these designs and the materials reflected the desire to create a worthy dwelling for God. God himself gave David the instructions for the temple, and we find that in First Chronicles chapter 28. It was a masterpiece. It was considered, even for its time, it's considered one of the most beautiful places on earth. And it was a testament to Israel's devotion, and again, this is such a holy place because this is where Isaac was almost sacrificed. So the construction and the design. We know a lot about it from 1 Kings chapters 6 through 7, and then 2 Chronicles chapters 3 through 4 to really talk about the design and some of the details. And again, I'm going to have some scriptures. You can look those up if you wish, but there's a lot of specific details about them. But yet at the same time, even though we have details, all of the things you see here are artist renditions because we don't know exactly what it looks like. We know what the design specifications were, but then obviously an artist was going to do it differently. So there's a little bit of things that we don't know about it. So again, he started building his temple in the fourth year of his reign, around 966 BC, somewhere in there. And we know it took 7 years to complete, according to the scriptures. The temple was designed according to the very divine specifications. And that's why I keep saying this, because God gave them these very specific designs, and he gave it to David. And they used only the finest material. They were very particular about that. And this included cedar from Lebanon. It had gold, silver, and all sorts of precious stones. But it was only the best given to God, just as we should only give the best to God. That's what they were doing. And we'll go into a little bit more about some of the things that are in the design itself. So, a little more on the construction. Again, it was built in about 10th century BCE. And one of the things that's very interesting is that it did take 7 years to do it. And then he also built his palace, which I'll jump into. But he worked a lot with the King Hiram. And King Hiram and David formed an alliance that we know of in 2 Samuel 5, chapter 5. And it continued on to 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. Hiram provided cedar and cypress and promised to deliver them by sea, and we saw that in 1 Kings, the fifth chapter. And Solomon then reciprocated with wheat and oil, that we also know in the same chapter. And then Solomon employed a Tyrian craftsman who also had the name Hiram, and some stonemasons from Cabal. They only hired the best and only had the very best that they gave to God. But you can also see the size of it up here in the corner too, about where the temple are, and about the size of a football field of today. Kind of gives you a rough estimate of it. At the same time, he was building his palace. And we know this from Second Chronicles, and it fills a lot of the details. His palace took an additional 13 years because he wanted to focus on having the temple done. And we know that in this whole thing, we know that the trees were sent as rafts to the city of Joppa and the Mediterranean coast. And again, like I said, there was a lot of different things that were gone in here, and you can see the dimensions of the palace. And the palace was big. The temple wasn't as big. But I also think we have to consider that he was a king and he had a lot of wives and concubines and probably needed a lot of space. But it is interesting because the most precious things, from everything I've read, all of the most precious things actually went into the temple first. So that was the focus. And Solomon, in the beginning, he started out very much focusing on the temple. And then later on, well, he kind of got a little off kilter a little bit there towards the end. So what about the architecture? And again, there's different artist renditions, but again, it's very detailed in First King and Second Chronicles. There's a lot of problems if we try to restructure. There's been a lot of models made of it and a lot of drawings, but there's an ambiguity of ancient technical terms. So structurally, the temple is classified as a rectangular, longer than wide, with a porch and a sanctuary, Holy of Holies, and as a straight axis temple. There's a lot of different models out there that you can look at, but again, they're all slightly different because we don't know exactly. For example, these pillars, there's two giant bronze pillars. We don't know exactly what they look like. We have a pretty good idea. We know that how tall they were. We know what they were made of, but we don't always know the exact look of them. And again, these two pillars, this is kind of interesting. Jachin and Boaz were the names of them. They were one on either side. And this whole thing was an enclosed roof. Some people think that some of the roof was open, but for the most part, most people agree that it was a closed roof, and that also impacted the pillars. So when I say the closed roof, I mean up here at the top here, this part here. There's some drawings you'll see where this over here above the pillars was open, and others where it's not. And I can't totally give you a complete answer on that one. So we knew some little details about it, that the porch where the sanctuary is 40 by 20 by 30 cubic chamber. And this is where the menorah, a table, and a gold clover altar was. We know the showbread was there, and a door with a cherubim led to the Holy of Holies. And you can see here. This is where they had the door here. And beyond the porch, let's see. Okay, and then the walls were cedar, and they were covered with gold. They had cherubim, palms, flowers, and we have the description of that in 1 Kings chapter 6. There were gold chains that separated it from the Holy of Holies. The floor was overlaid with gold as well. Olive wood doorposts held the doors, and the Holy of Holies doors were covered in olive wood, and they all had gold covered coverings all over them. So there was, again, the 7-branch menorah, the altar of incense, the showbread were all in these areas. All this was gold. Everything was gold in there. So the Holy of Holies, and it's known as the inner house, and it was a perfect cube. It measured 20 cubes in length, breadth, and height, and it contrasted with sanctuary's 30 cubic height, suggesting that the Holy of Holy floors was elevated, but we don't know that for sure. It's just that's what they think. That would be similar to other ancient temples of the time, and the floor and panel were covered with cedar from Lebanon, and then they were overlaid with gold. They know there were 600 talents of gold, or roughly 20 metric tons of gold, just in that room. With the innermost sanctum had the 2 cherubim made of olive wood, each 10 cubic high, with a wingspan of 10 cubits. They were placed side by side, with their wings touching the walls, and met in the center of the room. There was a 2-leaf door overlaid with gold, separated by the Holy of Holies from the holy place. And then there was the veil, or the purple curtain of purple, crimson, and linen to further obscure the view of the entrance. The Holy of Holies, of course, had no windows, and it was considered God's dwelling place. And the place was specifically prepared to house the Ark of the Covenant from 1 Kings chapter 6. And upon the temple's dedication, the ark containing the tablets and the commandments were placed in there, in that room. One of the things that I've read about is when they would work on the room and they were building it, they actually would lower people down. There had to be priests that went into there, even when they were building it, and they would lower them down into the room rather than having them walk around in the room. Because once everything was placed, especially once the curtain was placed, and then once you put the ark in there, only the high priest could go in there. So that's why it was that way, but they had such reverence for it. So one of the other things you see is that there's chambers around the temple on the south, the west, and the north sides. And we know this from 1 Kings chapter 6. These were integrated in the temple structure and served as storage areas. We believe that they're 1 story high, and they had the possibility of 2 additional stories being added later for all of the grain and all of the things that they would need. And the courts. The temple was surrounded by 2 courts. In the Bible, we know that there's an inner court, which is known as the court of the priest from 2 Chronicles chapter 4, separated by the outer area by a wall constructed with 3 layers of hewn stone topped with cedar beams. And that's from 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 36. And the inner court housed the altar of the burnt offerings and the brazen sea laver, and 10 other lavers, which we're going to get into. And the brazen altar was 20 cubic square, 10 cubics high, and it stood before the temple itself. And surrounding the entire temple complex was the great court where the people gathered for worship. So some of the features that are also in here. The molten sea. I thought this one was so interesting about it. It was very upfront and it was very prominent. It highlighted the grandeur of the structure and the importance of ritual purity and worship. It's called the molten sea, but it also could be called the brazen sea. And it was a large bronze basin in Solomon's temple, and it was used for the priestly washings or blessings. And it's described in First Kings chapter 7 and 2 Chronicles. And it was located in the southeastern corner of the inner court. We know it was 10 cubics in diameter, 5 cubics high, 30 cubics in circumference. And its brim you can see it's supposed to resemble a lily. And then, of course, you have the calves at the bottom of it. And those are actually oxen, and there's 12 of them, 1 for each of the tribes, and 3 facing each cardinal direction. So you have them going in 4 directions. What's fascinating is that First Kings suggests that a capacity of 2,000 baths, approximately 90 cubic meters. And then in Second Chronicles, you hear that it's actually 3,000 baths. How many times it could be bathed, emphasizing its role in purifying the priest through immersion. The priest would actually be immersed in there. And the basin suggests the water likely flowed into a subcontainer for easier access. But again, we don't know. And there's a lot of things we don't know about that, where it came from. But we know that the water was supplied by the Gideonites, and it was later brought through a conduit through the Solomon's pools that they created, and it had to come from fresh water. The bronze that used in construction came from a lot of captured cities, and it was originally it was not placed on it was placed on the ground, and then King Asa moved it and put it under stone pavement, as you see here, underneath of it to support the weight. So the sad thing is it was destroyed during the Babylonian Empire. And it was a very prominent feature. When you went in there, that's one of the first things you would have seen. The other thing was for ritual purification, was you would seen these laviers. And what's interesting about this, there were 10 of them. Next week, I'm going to dive into how much, I'm going to touch on this today, but all of the number of sacrifices and the need for ritual purification, the constant need, and how many people there were. There was a lot more people than a lot more priests and a lot more people that were working there than is often realized. So there needed to be a lot of water for the cleansing and the purification. So along with the one that was for the priest, the higher priest, then you also have these smaller ones for washing as well. Then there's 10 of them. And each one of them hold 40 baths of water and were located outside the temple. These were portable bronze stands equipped with wheels and were decorated with figures of a lion, a cherub, and palm trees. We know about that from 1 Kings chapter 7. And it also talks about the importance of them in there and the need for purification. And then in Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, he adds the temple vessels were made of a copper gold alloy and then was covered in gold. So again, even these were covered in gold. So then that brought me to, how much gold are we talking about? So there's a lot of challenges because we don't know exactly what a talent was. So I worked this out with several different things and came up with some estimates. These are very rough estimates of how much gold was used. It's very difficult to tell that. But these are some, we think that a talent was about 30 kilograms. And the gold, we do know the gold in the Holy of Holies was 600 talents. So that'd be 18,000 kilograms of gold. Okay, it's a big assumption, but let's say the gold used for other items in the temple were equal to that amount. So let's go with another 18,000 kilograms. It could actually be more than that because of the walls and some of the other things in there. So let's just call it a very low ball of 36,000 kilograms of gold. And I found the gold prices for a couple of years ago, and gold was about $60,000 per kilogram, and that does fluctuate daily. So if you take that amount, you're talking about over $2 billion just to build this, just for the gold. That's not everything else. That's just the gold. And keep in mind, like I said, it could be a very different one, different than that. But that just kind of gives you an estimate of the value they put upon this and how much they dedicated to putting into this, into building the temple. So the ark. So I just had a vision of when you hear them that they were bringing the ark in and the temple's finally built and we're finally happy that it's there and they're bringing it in. That we know that there was a huge celebration. We know from and especially when you read in 2 Samuel chapter 6, it really talks about the celebration that was done there. This act cemented Jerusalem's role as being the central point. We knew that David had an altar on Mount Moriah before that, from 2 Samuel chapter 24 and 1 Chronicles chapters 21. And they knew that this would be the spot where the temple would rise. But this was a huge step. This was such a big deal in with the Jewish faith and Israelites of how their beliefs came together. And it really cemented the 12 tribes working together to do this and coming together. So it really was amazing for them. Now, we do know that Herod's temple was a little more elaborate. But this was special, and this was built from the heart, and this was built from bringing what really coming forward for it. And there's such a difference to this. It was giving God the best they had. We know that the dedication was the seventh month of the year. The Feast of Tabernacles was when the priests and Levites brought the Ark of the Covenant from the city of David and placed it within the temple inside the Holy of Holies. So on the dedication, it was a huge party. It's detailed. There's a lot about it in 1 Kings chapter 8 and 2 Chronicles chapter 6. One of the things that's amazing, as the priests emerged from the Holy of Holies after placing the ark within it, a powerful cloud filled the temple and it stopped the ceremony. They just stopped it right there. At First Kings 8, verses 10 and 11, and then 2 Chronicles 5, verses 13 and 14 describe it. They didn't know what it was, but this cloud was signifying the glory of God was so intense that the priests couldn't even stand to be there. They couldn't stand to minister. They had to leave. And Solomon interpreted this as a divine acceptance of his work. And it was talked about in 1 Kings chapter 8. And he referenced the cloud's significance from the book of Leviticus, where we know where the cloud was moving with the tabernacle and the ark at the time. So the priests had stopped. So Solomon led the Israel in prayer, acknowledging the temple as a fulfillment of God's promise to his father David. He dedicated it as a house of prayer and reconciliation for Israelites and the foreigners. And he recognized the paradox of the infinite God within a finite structure, and which he wanted to acknowledge that God's willingness to come down and be with them. And the dedication included with music, a massive sacrifice, and we're going to get into that sacrifice, 22,000 bulls, 120,000 sheep. And that's from 1 Kings chapter 8 and 2 Chronicles chapter 7. And due to the altar size, it wasn't big enough. So these sacrifices had to be offered in the outer court instead of the inner court like they normally would have done. The celebration spanned 8 days, and it drew a vast assembly from Hamath to the Brook of Egypt, and it was then combined with the Feast of Tabernacles, which was right after that. So the festivals lasted 14 days to celebrate building this temple, and after which the people did return home. Following the dedication, God spoke to Solomon in a dream and confirmed that he'd heard his prayers and would continue to hear the prayers of the people if they humbled themselves, prayed, sought his face, and turned from their wicked ways. And that's documented in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14 and 15. But God also warned them that if they forsook his commandments and worshiped other gods, he would abandon the temple. And he said, "This house which I have sanctified for my name, I will cast out of my sight." 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 7. The dedication, it really marked the central place of worship, and really where everybody came together. It was the gathering place. It was the cultural and religious gathering place for everyone. We know the sacrifices were offered, the feasts were observed. There were different feasts that Jewish males had to go to the temple for. And it was a place to seek God's presence, his forgiveness, his guidance, and just was a symbol of Israel's unique relationship with the Lord. And again, this one was something from the heart and something that the people came together and really wanted and really put together. So the dedication. I mentioned that there were 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So one of the things is I was trying to estimate how many sacrifices there were. We don't know how many people were there at the time. We know that there was at least 500,000, but could have been up to 1 million people. So we know that in addition to what King Solomon sacrificed, there had to be other animals sacrificed because the people had to offer sacrifices. So there is, and that sacrifice we think was probably about 0.28 animals per person, but it's still a lot. It's still a lot of sacrificing. So basically, we're looking at by the time we got done of all of the sacrificing and for that time, that year and everything, if you compared that to today, if we did that today, right now, there's 15 million Jews in the world. Okay, so if you applied that to today's standards, and if the new temple is built and we did it the same way, we would be looking at 4.26 million animals to come to equal what they did at their time. It's a staggering amount, and it's just unbelievable the dedication they put into this and what they did. So the blood is what washed away their sin. From a Jewish perspective, the sacrificial system is served as divine ordinance, meaning achieving atonement and reconciliation with God. The use of the blood in these sacrifices stem from the fundamental expressed from Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. For the life of the creature is in the blood. I have given you this altar to make atonement for your lives, for its blood makes atonement. So it was an atonement. It's not the same as what Jesus did. And remember, they had to do this weekly for the Sabbath sacrifices, and yearly for Yom Kippur. So it's not the same, but it's a foreshadowing of what was to come. So we know that there's a deep connection between the blood and the life, and the shedding of blood symbolized the offering of life, acknowledging the sanctity of life and the consequences of our sin. But these sacrifices weren't simply about the physical act. They were a form of a spiritual expression too. They represented the individual's remorse for their action, the desire to return to a state of closeness with God. So the offering of the animal, while it did not erase the sin itself, because it can't, served as a tangible demonstration of the desire and wanting to reconcile with God. It was a way of acknowledging God's sovereignty and seeking his forgiveness. And that's how Jews look at this. It's a way of seeking that forgiveness. It's important to note, while these are central to the temple service, they aren't the only means that they had of achieving atonement. They believed in repentance, prayer, good deeds also played crucial roles in the process of spiritual cleansing and reconciliation with God. So even when the temple went away, there are still ways that they can connect with God. But yes, the sacrifices are a huge thing. So then I was looking at how the blood volume, just because I thought it was fascinating. And so you can see there's approximately 463 gallons of blood that would have been sacrificed just in that dedication, just Solomon's part of the dedication. But there were also types of sacrifices. And I mentioned that there was the daily offerings. So we know from Numbers 23, verses 3 through 8, the passage deals with the daily burnt offerings. And those consisted of 2 lambs, one in the morning, one in the evening. And it was very specific, the accompanying grain and drink offerings after that. We also have that from Exodus 29, verses 38 through 42, and it described the daily offerings and that it had to be going continual. Then you have your Sabbath offerings. And Numbers 28, 9 through 10 tells us that there were always 2 lambs with the grain and drink offerings, in addition to the daily offerings that had to be done. Then there's monthly offerings. And in Numbers 28, 11 through 15, and it talks about the new moon festival where we had the young bulls, a ram, lambs, and goats for the sin offering. Then you have the festivals. So for Passover, we know from Leviticus 23, 4 through 8, Numbers 28, 16 through 25, and Deuteronomy of what sacrifices are there. And then you have the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which is in Leviticus and Numbers as well. And like I said, I'll give you the scriptures. The weeks of Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot. We also have more that we have to give at the Day of Atonement, a Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So each one of these had to have different things. So the best guess that I could come up with by reading all this and looking at everything I could find on it, the lambs on a yearly sacrifice, this is just the temple's part, 1,200 to 1,500 lambs. That accounts for your daily, your Sabbath, monthly, and a moderate estimate for festival sacrifices. Now, keep in mind, it probably was much higher than that, but that's a modest estimate. The bulls would be 50 to 75 again, and the festivals, sometimes they'd offer a lot more. Rams was about the same, 50 to 75, and goats would have been the same again. But these are very, very rough estimates. We don't actually know. We know the lamb offering for the daily and the Sabbath were fixed. But the rest of those are all just guesses because it's hard to tell. So again, we're looking at the blood here. And just the blood for the yearly would have come to lambs would be about 5,400 liters, bulls about 4,500 liters, and rams 2,205. So that means you're talking about 15,000 additional liters of blood that were spilled just to make that connection. And the reason I went into so much detail about this is because this is the dedication that they had. This is where they had so much passion and dedication and wanted to connect with the Lord. As I said, there's tons of details in the Bible, but there's also things we don't know. And so we can only go by what we know. I'm just guessing, and I have to lowball it because I don't know for sure how much they were giving. But with that amount of blood that was being spilled, think about that. And then think about the contrast of Jesus. Let's tie it back into him and what he did for us. We don't have to do what was done here. We don't have to do all of those things. We just have to come to Jesus. And that's how precious and wonderful his blood was and still is. And the difference between what was done before and what the Jewish people are having to do and what was given to us that follow him. And I always think we should look back at this. Like I said, there's tons of details. You can go way more in detail than I did on this. And again, I'm going to show you a bunch of scriptures on it, but there's just so many things to think about how we don't have to do that ourselves. So then we do know that the first temple fell, and the destruction was in 586 BCE. And there were a couple of things that happened here. The devastating blow was 2 Kings 25, marking the end of nearly 4 centuries of its existence. The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. We know that from 2 Kings, chapter 25. And this is also when he exiled the people. And where did this come from? We know that this catastrophe resulted from Israel's idolatry and disobedience. And we know that from 2 Kings chapter 25. It was earlier plundered in 1 Kings chapter 14. And then Jehoshaphat, I think so I always pronounce his name, is in 2 Kings chapter 14. Both of those foreshadowed it. There was a warning. God gave them a warning, but they didn't listen. And they still continued in their sinful ways, and that led to the destruction of the temple. But despite its loss, the temple's legacy endured, and it became the blueprint for the second temple. And the second temple, like I said, wasn't built the same way and the same fashion as the first one, but it also foreshadows all of it with Jesus is coming as well. And it's still a powerful symbol of the people with the relationship they had with God. It was a reminder of the past glory. And they consider it a hope for future redemption, sustaining them even when they were in exile. The legacy still influences the prayers, rituals, and a longing for restoration. This temple was built by Solomon as thanksgiving and wanting to connect with the Lord. Herod's temple, we'll be exploring that next week a little bit differently. But I was going to tell you how I came up with some of this stuff. And I'm also going to show you the spreadsheet that I created, and I have a link, and I will give you the link to it as well. But the primary source is the Hebrew Bible, of course, and mainly in the book of Kings and Chronicles, where it really gets the construction and goes into all of the details. And they're way more detailed than what I was talking about. And I know I was going kind of more heavy than I usually do in things. But there's also the prophetic visions and Isaiah, um, and Jeremiah, Ezekiel. There's a lot of different things. And then the book of Psalms also talks about it. The Talmud, we've talked about the Talmud. It's the rabbinic discussions. There's a lot in it about the details. And there's a lot of different things like that. And then there's the Mishnah. There was also some other rabbinical teachings, the Midrash, and then Josephus' writing, were all really good, valuable places for information. So now I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that screen. And I want to show you just from the slides, and this is just the slides that I did today, what the details were. Okay, can you see this? You should be able to see the slides. And each one of those, when I went through the slides, these were the scriptures that coincided with the slides. And I will give in the chat, I will put a link to it. But you can see there's so many details about it. And it's just the love and the dedication they had for it. And I'm sure there's a lot more out there about it, but these were just the ones that I used as I was doing the research on this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll put in the chat, I'll put the, and did want to tell you one last thing. So next week, we are going to look at Herod's temple. And what I was going to announce is that on the 9th, we're going to be looking and researching Purim. And the reason is because on March 13th is Purim. So we're going to be looking at our Jewish holiday that will be coming up very soon here. So next week, Herod's temple. The week after that, we'll be looking and preparing for Purim so that you can celebrate it if you wish on the 13th of March. So now I'm going to open it up to, would any of the elders like to talk about the temple and what we discussed today?
It's good morning. I want to say, afternoon, evening. Thank you, Gail. That was really in depth to be able to see how much blood. That was so interesting. That part, just as you kept bringing it forward, how much blood it took for the different sacrifices, how much blood that was really given. Each time was sacrificed. I thought that was real fascinating. I was like, you don't think about it. I didn't think about it, but realizing how valuable blood is to us within our bodies, and then realizing how, the sacrifices of the blood and the cleansing of the body, cleansing of the sins and everything, how important it is to really realize, wow, what Jesus did was so important. It was, I'm just like, wow, it's a lot of blood that the animals, and then their lives, the preparation, everything that went into doing the sacrifice and everything. So thank you. That was really good.
Well, next week we're also going to talk a little bit more about that, because Herod's temple, it was bigger, and we're going to be talking about some of the things, but I think that there's more things to really look at. I actually started kind of geeking out a little bit here, and started really looking at how many people were working there and what it meant. What does the money changers really mean to us today? When we hear that Jesus chased out the money changers, I was actually surprised. There's so many more things and nuances that in the details that we don't always look at and we don't always understand. And that's where I got out of all of this, was that how important this was, and how we should actually kind of understand that this was that important to the Jewish people and to God, that there were so many details. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I did get a question about Israel left Egypt with at least 2 million people. David did a census in 1 Chronicles 21 and found over 1.5 million men who could use the sword. So how did I estimate the population for Solomon's time? That is the population they believe was in Jerusalem, because we're only going with that. There's no way to know how many Jews there really were at the time. So I went totally with low estimates. I only went with very low estimates. It it could be as much as 4 to 5 times higher than that, honestly. I don't know. And there's just no way for me to know that. I couldn't find anything that referenced it. But even with that, just how much blood you're talking about. And one of the interesting things is the blood. Now, some of it had to be used on the altar and some of it had to be used for that, but there was still a lot of blood left over. And they actually had a way of taking it and putting it out into the crops. And they would fertilize. They would fertilize the crops with the blood. The other thing is you have to think about, and we'll talk more about this next week. But all of the other they needed the blood and they sacrificed the animals. What they do with the animals? Well, the animals, the priest ate part of them and used different things, but they still you still had the leather from the because they skinned them. You had the leather. You had all of the grain stuff. You had all of these things. There was, and we're going to talk about how much money was probably in the time of Jesus's time and what we were really talking about. What clued me in on that and is the fact that Rome was so fast. Why did Rome build a garrison right next to the temple, overlooking the temple? And it was because of the money that was going in and out of the temple. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of resources. When you think about how many animals you're talking there, how many skins, how much meat are we talking? You know, when we look at the different gates, my husband had a funny way of putting it when we were talking about it and researching this. But he had a funny way of putting it. He said, and that's maybe not in Solomon's time, but in Herod's time, you saw you saw all of the different gates for taking out different things. There was different there's gates to take out the dead bodies. There were gates, all these different things, but there was no free gate. There was no gate giving out free food or anything like that. So these all became profit, and that was the problem. Solomon. Well, David in particular really wanted this to be a worship to God and from the heart. But there was a lot of money involved here, and there's a lot of things, and unfortunately, that can bring corruption, as we see later on, and that's why the temple was destroyed, because the corruption that comes with that. So it really was that you have to be focused on the Lord and where your heart is. Um, and was it just the Levites who did every task within the temple? In the inner sanctuary, yes. The family of the Levites also became very wealthy, and they didn't own land, but they became very wealthy. And like I said, we'll talk more about the money aspect of it next week with the money changers. But yes, in the inner part, yes. But then they hired people to do other things. You had bakers for the making the bread. Now the priests had to bake some of the bread, but some of the things were not necessarily. But only Jews could have gone into this area, so they were at least Jews, but they may have not been Levites. But in the inner part, the sacrificing, those things all had to be the Levites. I hope that helped. Any other questions? Well, as I said, next week we will be looking a little bit more. I'll try not, I'll probably have another breakdown like I do with this week with the scriptures if you'd like to see it. Um, because we get into a lot of details with some things and there's a lot of information out there, but the scriptures are your wealth of information. And, I have to admit, when I get into, oh, when I get into the First Kings and get into some of the First and Second Chronicles, when I get into those, sometimes I had always thought it was a little boring to look at it and to look at the details. But then doing this and really going in and looking at it and researching it, made me realize it's not boring. There's so much there about what was done and why things were done and how they did it and why God had them doing it. So there's so much there for you to see. And I hope you guys look at that and look into it. But again, I have put that link in there if you'd like to look at my spreadsheet. And it's just my spreadsheet. It's just what I had come up for when I was doing the slides. So any other last questions or comments from anyone about this? And anybody can unmute at this point. Okay. Well, again, I hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, next week we will be looking at Herod's temple, and then we'll be looking at Purim. And I hope you have a chance before we get to Purim to read the book of Esther. And a little piece of trivia for you that there is only one book in the entire Bible that does not mention the name of God, and that's the book of Esther. Nowhere in the book of Esther does it mention the name of God. And it is very unique in that. It's also a very unique story of that it's included into the Bible. So I hope you look forward to that as well. And with that, I'm going to close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for allowing us to come and learn about your temple and to learn about your people. And Lord, help us to understand the significance that there was for the first temple and what it meant and just how it was so important, and it still is today, and it's going to be in the future. All the things that were done in the temple of the time, in Solomon's time, and all of those things that come forward, they gave their best. They were purposely doing the very best they had, and help us to understand that we also need to do that, to give the best to you, only the best, and to give it all to you. And Lord, thank you so much. And if there was anything that was off and not of what you wanted us to hear today, please correct that and help me guide us and help us to understand those things so that we're only aligned with you, using the sword of the Spirit, severing soul ties with anyone or anything, so that we are only aligned with you and only hear your word. In your precious name, amen. Shalom, everyone. I hope to see you next week. And like I said, we'll be looking at Herod's Temple. And if you want to read ahead, please feel free to do that. And also look forward to seeing you to discuss Purim. Shalom. Bye, everyone.